Some men are born evil, others choose it, but a rare few become something else entirely. The humid air of Medellin clung to Marcus Reeves like a second skin as he crouched behind rusted shipping containers, watching the most impossible scene of his 30-year career unfold. Through his binoculars, he could see them clearly. 6 of Griselda Blanco's most ruthless enforcers, automatic weapons trained on a man who should have been untouchable. Pablo Escobar sat calmly in that metal chair, wrists bound, yet his face carried the serene confidence of a man attending Sunday Mass. Marcus had spent decades hunting this ghost, studying every photograph, every witness account, every whispered legend about the king of cocaine. He knew Escobar's face better than his own father's, and yet something felt different about the man in that warehouse, something that made Marcus's weathered hands tremble against the cold steel of his binoculars. When Escobar's lips moved, speaking words too distant to hear, Marcus watched 6 armed killers drop like marionettes with severed strings. No gunshots, no struggle, just silence and the growing certainty that he was witnessing something that would rewrite everything he thought he knew about power. What kind of man could kill with a whisper? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus remained frozen behind the shipping container for what felt like hours but couldn't have been more than minutes. The warehouse had fallen into a silence so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. No groaning metal, no distant traffic, not even the ever-present hum of insects that plagued Medellin's industrial district. Through his binoculars, the 6 bodies lay scattered across the concrete floor like discarded dolls, their weapons still clutched in lifeless hands. And Escobar? He sat motionless in that metal chair, head tilted slightly as if listening to music only he could hear. The rope around his wrists had somehow loosened, though Marcus hadn't seen him move to free himself. A thin smile played at the corners of his mouth, the expression of a man who had just won a game no one else knew they were playing. Marcus lowered the binoculars, his 40-year smoking habit making his breathing ragged in the thick air. His hands shook as he fumbled for the radio clipped to his belt, then stopped. Who would he call? What would he say? That he'd just watched the most wanted man in the world kill 6 armed captors without moving from his chair? That would earn him a psych evaluation and a one-way ticket to a Florida retirement home. The smart play was to retreat, to slip back through the maze of abandoned warehouses and pretend he'd never been here. After all, this wasn't even an official operation. Marcus had been chasing rumors for 3 weeks, whispers from informants about a meeting between the Medellin cartel's most dangerous enemies. Griselda Blanco had been gunning for Escobar for months, their war spilling blood across half of Colombia. When Marcus caught wind that her people might finally have cornered him, he couldn't resist the pull of one last hunt. 30 years with the DEA had taught him to trust his instincts, but his instincts were screaming contradictory warnings. Run, stay. This changes everything. This changes nothing. You're losing your mind. You're finally seeing clearly. Through the grimy warehouse windows, Escobar began to move. He stood slowly, rolling his shoulders like a man working out morning stiffness, and walked among the bodies with the casual air of someone inspecting merchandise. He paused beside each fallen gunman, occasionally nudging them with his foot, though Marcus couldn't tell if he was checking for signs of life or simply admiring his handiwork. Marcus raised the binoculars again, his training overriding his fear. Document everything. Details mattered, even if, especially if, no one would believe them. Escobar wore simple clothes, dark jeans, a white cotton shirt, brown leather boots. Nothing remarkable except for how unremarkable he looked. This was supposed to be a man who commanded armies, who had declared war on the Colombian government itself. Yet he appeared smaller in person, softer around the edges, more like a middle-aged shopkeeper than the demon Marcus had spent his career hunting. But those eyes. Even at this distance, even through the distortion of cheap binoculars, there was something unsettling about Escobar's eyes. They seemed too bright, too knowing, as if they could see through the warehouse walls and spot Marcus crouched in his hiding place. As if responding to that thought, Escobar turned and looked directly at his position. Marcus's blood turned to ice water. There was no way Escobar could see him, not with the angle, not with the distance, not with the maze of shipping containers providing cover, yet the man's gaze locked onto his location with laser precision, and that thin smile widened into something that might have been amusement. Escobar raised one hand in a gesture that could have been a greeting or a dismissal, then turned and walked toward the warehouse's rear exit. His movement was unhurried, purposeful, like a man leaving a successful business meeting. Within moments, he had vanished into the labyrinth of Medellin's industrial sprawl, leaving behind only questions and corpses. Marcus waited another 10 minutes before emerging from his hiding spot, his legs cramped from crouching, his shirt soaked through with nervous sweat. The warehouse felt different now, charged with an energy that made his skin crawl and his teeth ache. He approached the building with the caution of a man defusing a bomb, each step deliberate and measured. The side door hung ajar, its rusty hinges creaking in the faint breeze. Marcus drew his service weapon, though after what he'd witnessed, the familiar weight of the gun felt more like a security blanket than actual protection. He pushed through the doorway and immediately gagged at the smell. Not death, exactly, but something wrong, something that didn't belong in the world he understood. The 6 bodies lay exactly as he'd seen them through his binoculars, but up close, the impossibility of their deaths became even more apparent. No blood, no wounds, no signs of struggle or poison. Their faces wore expressions of mild surprise, as if they'd simply forgotten how to continue living. And in the center of it all, that metal chair sat empty, still warm to the touch. Marcus knelt beside the nearest body and checked for a pulse he knew he wouldn't find. The man's skin felt normal. No fever, no unusual coolness, just the gradual temperature drop of recent death. But his eyes remained open, staring at nothing with an expression Marcus had never seen in 30 years of crime scenes. Not fear, not pain, not even confusion, just emptiness, as if something essential had simply departed. He forced himself to examine each corpse, his DEA training providing a clinical framework to process the impossible. 6 men, all between 25 and 40, all armed with high-end weapons that hadn't been fired. Their fingers weren't even near the triggers. Whatever had killed them had happened too fast for defensive reactions, too completely for struggle. The smell grew stronger as he worked, that wrongness that seemed to coat his throat and make his vision blur at the edges. Marcus had investigated cartel executions, mass graves, crime scenes that had baked in Colombian heat for weeks. This was different. This smelled like the moment before lightning strikes, ozone and electricity, and something that made his primitive brain scream warnings about predators in the dark. By the time he finished his improvised investigation, the sun had shifted enough to cast long shadows through the warehouse windows. Marcus holstered his weapon and walked outside, his legs unsteady. The normal sounds of Medellin had returned, distant traffic, construction noise, the ever-present hum of a city that never truly slept. But everything felt muffled, as if he were experiencing the world through thick glass. The drive back to his apartment took 40 minutes through streets he'd navigated thousands of times, yet everything looked subtly wrong. Colors seemed oversaturated. Shadows fell at impossible angles. People on the sidewalks moved with jerky, puppet-like motions that made his eyes water when he tried to focus on them. Marcus parked in the narrow space behind his building and sat in the baking heat of his ancient Jeep, trying to process what he'd witnessed. His hands had stopped shaking, but only because a deeper tremor had settled into his bones, something that vibrated at a frequency just below conscious awareness. His apartment occupied the 3rd floor of a converted colonial mansion in Laureles, a neighborhood that had seen better decades but still maintained traces of faded elegance. The other tenants included a retired professor, a young couple who taught at the local university, and an elderly woman who had lived there since before Pablo Escobar was born. It was quiet, anonymous, the kind of place where a man could disappear into routine and forget the weight of the world. Marcus climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling like he was surfacing from deep water. The professor's door stood slightly ajar, and he could hear classical music drifting from inside, something peaceful and orderly that belonged to a universe where impossible things stayed properly impossible. His own apartment was spartanly furnished, a single bedroom, a kitchen barely large enough for one person, a living room dominated by a wooden desk covered in case files and newspaper clippings. 3 decades of hunting monsters had taught him that possessions were just anchors, and anchors could drag you down when you needed to move fast. But the walls told a different story. Photographs covered every available surface, not the expected crime scene shots or surveillance photos, but pictures of people. Marcus with his ex-wife Elena before the job drove them apart. Marcus with his former partner Jimmy Rodriguez before a cartel bullet found him in Bogota. Marcus with his daughter Sarah at her college graduation before she moved to Seattle and their phone calls dwindled to Christmas and birthdays. He poured 3 fingers of aguardiente and sat at his desk, staring at the most recent addition to his wall, a photo of his granddaughter Emma, whom he'd met exactly once during an awkward visit 6 months ago. 5 years old, with Sarah's eyes and a smile that could light up rooms. In the photo, she was reaching toward the camera with paint-covered fingers, trying to touch his face through the lens. The aguardiente burned going down, but it couldn't wash away the taste of that wrongness from the warehouse. Marcus picked up the phone twice to call Sarah, then set it down both times. What would he say? That he was finally cracking, under the weight of 3 decades spent chasing evil? That he might have witnessed something that challenged every assumption he'd built his life around? That he was tired of being alone with ghosts? Outside his window, Medellin spread across the valley like a living organism, millions of lights beginning to flicker on as evening approached. Somewhere in that maze of streets and favelas, Pablo Escobar was planning his next move, protected by whatever impossible power Marcus had witnessed. And somewhere else, in a warehouse that smelled like lightning, 6 bodies lay cooling in the gathering darkness. Marcus refilled his glass and opened the first of what he knew would be many case files tonight. Because the only thing worse than accepting the impossible was accepting that he might be losing his mind. The phone rang at 3:47 a.m., jolting Marcus from a restless sleep filled with dreams of empty eyes and that electric smell. He'd fallen asleep at his desk, case files scattered around him like oversized playing cards, his neck stiff from hours hunched over reports that refused to make sense of what he'd witnessed. Reeves. His voice came out as a croak. Marcus, it's Rodriguez. We need you at the morgue. Now. Marcus sat up straighter, recognizing the voice of his former partner's younger brother, Carlos, who worked as a forensics investigator for the Colombian National Police. They'd maintained an uneasy professional relationship, Carlos providing occasional information, Marcus offering insights from his DEA experience. But Carlos had never called at this hour, and his voice carried an edge that made Marcus's stomach tighten. What happened? 6 bodies came in tonight. Industrial district. Thing is, Carlos paused, and Marcus could hear him light a cigarette with shaking hands. Thing is, Marcus, they're saying these men died of heart attacks, all 6, simultaneously. No drugs in their systems, no trauma, nothing that explains it. But that's not the weird part. Marcus gripped the phone tighter. What's the weird part? The weird part is that 3 of my colleagues have quit in the last 4 hours, just walked out. Said they couldn't be in the same room with the bodies. And Marcus? Carlos's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I think I'm about to join them. There's something wrong here. Something that doesn't belong in our world. 20 minutes later, Marcus stood outside the Instituto Nacional de Medicina Legal, the humidity making his clothes stick to his skin despite the pre-dawn coolness. The building squatted like a concrete tombstone against the Medellin skyline, its windows glowing with harsh fluorescent light. He'd been here dozens of times over the years, had seen things that would give normal people nightmares for life, but tonight felt different. Carlos met him at the side entrance, looking like he'd aged a decade since their last meeting. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually immaculate appearance had deteriorated into rumpled clothes and stubble. Before we go in, Carlos said, his cigarette trembling between his fingers, I need you to know something. The warehouse where they found these bodies? It wasn't the first time we've seen this. Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. What do you mean? I mean there have been others. Over the past 2 years, maybe longer, bodies found in groups, all dead from simultaneous heart failure, all connected to the cartels somehow. But the files? Carlos took a long drag and exhaled slowly. The files keep disappearing. Evidence gets misplaced, witnesses change their stories or stop talking altogether. They walked through corridors that reeked of disinfectant and something underneath it that Marcus recognized from the warehouse, that electric wrongness that made his teeth ache. Carlos led him past empty examination rooms and darkened offices until they reached a heavy steel door marked with biohazard warnings. "My colleagues who left tonight," Carlos continued, "they said the bodies were whispering. Not out loud, you understand, but in here." He tapped his temple, like voices just below the threshold of hearing. The examination room beyond the steel door felt like stepping into a walk-in freezer, but the cold had nothing to do with temperature. 6 metal tables held 6 forms covered by white sheets, and the air thrummed with an energy that made Marcus's vision blur at the edges. Carlos pulled back the first sheet, revealing the face of a man Marcus recognized from the warehouse. But something was different. In death, the man's features had somehow become more defined, more angular, as if the flesh was drawing tight against the bone. His open eyes reflected the fluorescent lights with an oily sheen that reminded Marcus of oil slicks or insect wings. "Jesus," Marcus whispered. "Look at this," Carlos said, moving to another table. He pulled back the sheet to reveal extensive scarring across the man's chest and arms, ritual scarring, deliberate and precise. These marks weren't on the bodies when they arrived. They've been appearing over the last few hours. Marcus stared at the intricate patterns carved into dead flesh, patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when he wasn't looking directly at them. His rational mind searched for explanations, post-mortem changes, optical illusions, stress-induced hallucinations. But a deeper part of him, the part that had kept him alive through 3 decades of hunting predators, recognized something else entirely. "Carlos," he said slowly, "I need you to show me everything. Every file, every report, every piece of evidence that's connected to these kinds of deaths. All of it. Marcus, I told you. The files keep disappearing. Then we make copies before they can. We document everything." Marcus turned away from the tables and their impossible occupants. "Because I think what we're dealing with here isn't just Pablo Escobar. I think it's something that's been using the cartels as cover for a long time." Outside the examination room, Carlos locked the steel door with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "What are you saying?" Marcus looked back at the door, thinking of empty eyes and electric air and a man who killed with a whisper. "I'm saying we're about to find out how deep this rabbit hole goes." The drive from the morgue back to his apartment passed in a blur of streetlights and half-formed thoughts. Marcus gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white, trying to process what he'd committed himself to. "We're about to find out how deep this rabbit hole goes." The words had sounded confident when he'd spoken them, but now they felt like a death sentence. He parked behind his building and sat in the darkness, engine ticking as it cooled. Through his windshield, the pre-dawn sky was beginning to lighten over the mountains that ringed Medellin, painting the peaks in shades of purple and gold. It looked peaceful, normal, like the kind of sunrise that belonged in a world where dead men didn't grow ritual scars and whisper secrets to the living. But that world was gone now, wasn't it? Had been gone since the moment he'd watched Pablo Escobar kill 6 armed men with nothing but a smile and a whisper. Marcus climbed the stairs to his apartment, each step feeling heavier than the last. The professor's classical music had been replaced by silence, and even that felt ominous now. Everything felt ominous. The shadows between the stair railings seemed too deep. The hallway stretched longer than it should. The familiar creak of the 3rd step from the top sounded like a warning. Inside his apartment, Marcus poured another glass of aguardiente and stared at the photographs on his walls. Elena's face smiled back at him from their wedding day, young and hopeful and blissfully unaware that she was marrying a man who would choose the hunt over happiness. Sarah at her high school graduation, proud but already showing the wariness that would eventually drive her to the other side of the continent. Emma with her paint-covered fingers, reaching for a grandfather she barely knew. What the hell was he doing? Marcus set down his glass and picked up the phone, then immediately put it back down. He told Carlos they would investigate, would dig deeper into whatever supernatural conspiracy was hiding behind the cartel wars. But sitting here in his apartment, surrounded by the remnants of a life he'd already sacrificed to 30 years of chasing monsters, the magnitude of what he was contemplating hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't just another case. This wasn't tracking down another cartel boss or unraveling another drug network. This was something that challenged the fundamental nature of reality itself. And if he was wrong, if stress and age and too many years in the field had finally snapped something essential in his mind, then pursuing this investigation would be the final proof that Marcus Reeves had crossed the line from hunter to madman. He thought about his pension, sitting in a Florida bank account like a promise of normal life, fishing boats and quiet beaches and newspapers that only reported on normal human evil, no supernatural killers, no bodies that grew scars after death, no electric air that made reality shimmer at the edges. He thought about his daughter, who called exactly once a month out of duty rather than affection. What would happen to those calls if word got out that her father had lost his grip on sanity? What would happen to his relationship with Emma, tenuous as it was, if Sarah decided he was too unstable to be around her daughter? Marcus walked to his window and looked out over the city where Pablo Escobar moved like a supernatural force, protected by powers that shouldn't exist. Somewhere out there, other bodies might be cooling in other warehouses, marked with symbols that appeared after death. Somewhere, Carlos was probably sitting in his own apartment, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake by trusting a burned-out American agent with secrets that could get them both killed. The smart play was obvious. Call Carlos in the morning, tell him he'd been thinking about it and decided to let sleeping dogs lie. Pack up his files, buy a ticket to Miami, and spend the rest of his life pretending he'd never seen anything stranger than garden-variety human evil. Let someone else figure out what Pablo Escobar really was. Let someone else pay the price for understanding. But even as he thought it, Marcus knew he couldn't walk away. Not because he was brave, Christ, his hands were still shaking from the morgue, but because walking away meant accepting that the world contained horrors beyond his understanding, and he was too old and too stubborn to live with that kind of helplessness. He'd spent 3 decades hunting monsters. The fact that one of them might actually be monstrous in ways that defied explanation didn't change the fundamental equation. Evil was evil, whether it wore a human face or something else entirely. Marcus refilled his glass and returned to his desk, to the scattered case files that suddenly seemed inadequate and childish. He had perhaps 6 hours before Carlos would expect him to call. 6 hours to decide whether he was a man chasing truth or a madman chasing ghosts. Outside his window, Medellin awakened to another day of violence and secrets and impossible things hiding in plain sight. The aguardiente burned his throat, but it couldn't wash away the taste of decision. Marcus stared at the case files spread across his desk. 30 years of hunting human monsters, all of it suddenly feeling like practice for something he'd never imagined possible. The photographs on his walls watched him with silent judgment. Elena, who'd begged him to choose family over the hunt. Sarah, who'd stopped begging and simply left. Emma, who didn't even know her grandfather was capable of choosing anything but the next case. He was 58 years old. Too old to be chasing ghosts, too old to be starting over, too old to be rewriting everything he thought he knew about the nature of evil. But as the first light of dawn crept through his window, Marcus realized that age had nothing to do with it. Some doors, once opened, couldn't be closed again. Some truths, once glimpsed, demanded to be followed to their source. Marcus picked up the phone and dialed Carlos's number before he could change his mind. "I was wondering if you'd call," Carlos answered on the first ring, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and something else. Relief, maybe, at not being alone with this anymore. "The files you mentioned," Marcus said. "The ones that keep disappearing. Do you have copies?" A pause. "Some, hidden." "But Marcus, if we do this, if we really dig into whatever this is, there's no going back. These people, whatever they are, they don't leave loose ends." Marcus looked around his sparse apartment, at the life he'd built on the foundation of hunting monsters. No wife, no relationship with his daughter, no friends except other damaged men who understood the cost of staring too long into the abyss. What exactly did he have to lose? "I know," he said. "When can we meet?" 3 hours later, Marcus sat in a cafe in Poblado, nursing black coffee and watching the morning crowd of business people and university students flow past the windows. Normal people living normal lives, blissfully unaware that something impossible was walking among them. The irony wasn't lost on him. After 3 decades of protecting civilians from cartel violence, He was now sitting on knowledge that could shatter their understanding of reality itself. Carlos arrived 20 minutes late, carrying a worn leather satchel and looking like he hadn't slept. He slid into the booth across from Marcus and immediately lit a cigarette, his hands steadier than they'd been at the morgue, but still betraying the tremor of a man operating on pure adrenaline. "I've been thinking about what you said," Carlos began, pulling a manila folder from his satchel, "about this being bigger than just Escobar. I went back through 5 years of files, looking for patterns." He opened the folder, revealing newspaper clippings, police reports, and photographs that made Marcus's coffee turn to acid in his stomach. Crime scenes that looked familiar, groups of bodies, no obvious cause of death, the same electric wrongness that had permeated the warehouse. 17 separate incidents, Carlos continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Always cartel-related, always multiple simultaneous deaths, always followed by evidence disappearing or witnesses recanting their statements. But here's the thing that made me realize we're already past the point of no return. He pulled out a photograph that made Marcus's blood freeze. Pablo Escobar at what looked like a social gathering, surrounded by well-dressed men and women. But it wasn't Escobar that caught Marcus's attention. It was the face in the background, partially obscured by shadow but unmistakably familiar. "That's Miguel Rodriguez from the Cali cartel," Carlos said, pointing to the figure. "This photo was taken last month at a charity gala. Same event, same room. 2 men who've been at war for years, standing 10 feet apart, and neither one acknowledging the other's existence." Marcus studied the photograph, noting the unnatural stillness of the other party guests, the way shadows seemed to bend wrong around certain figures, the electric quality of the air that he could somehow sense even through the image. "They're not at war," Marcus said slowly, the pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. "They never were. It's all theater. The entire drug war," Carlos nodded. "All of it. Just cover for something else entirely." Marcus set down his coffee cup and leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of inevitability settle around him like a shroud. He thought of his pension in Florida, of quiet beaches and normal newspapers. He thought of his granddaughter's paint-covered fingers reaching toward the camera, toward a future he might not live to see. Then he thought of 6 bodies in a warehouse, of ritual scars appearing on dead flesh, of electric air and impossible whispers, and a man who killed with a smile. "Where do we start?" he asked. Carlos crushed out his cigarette and closed the folder. "We start by accepting that everything we thought we knew about this city, about this war, about the nature of evil itself, was wrong." Outside the cafe windows, Medellin pulsed with life and traffic and the rhythms of a city built on secrets. Marcus finished his coffee and followed Carlos into the morning heat, leaving behind the last vestiges of his old life, and stepping across a threshold he could never uncross. The hunt had found him one last time. The morning heat hit Marcus like a physical presence as they stepped onto the sidewalk, the air already thick with exhaust fumes and the promise of another scorching day. Carlos led him through a maze of side streets that Marcus had never noticed despite his years in Medellin, narrow passages between buildings where the shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. "The first thing you need to understand," Carlos said, glancing over his shoulder as they walked, "is that we're not the only ones who figured this out, but the others who tried to investigate." He left the sentence hanging like smoke in the humid air. They turned into an alley that dead-ended at a nondescript wooden door, painted green and scarred with decades of weather. Carlos knocked 3 times, paused, then knocked twice more. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 40s with prematurely gray hair and eyes that reminded Marcus of soldiers he'd known, people who'd seen too much and survived by becoming very good at reading danger. "Esperanza," Carlos said. "This is the American I told you about." She studied Marcus with the intensity of a jeweler examining a stone for flaws. "You're sure about him?" "As sure as I can be about anyone," Carlos replied. Esperanza stepped aside to let them enter. The space beyond was part apartment, part archive, shelves lined with files, boxes stacked floor to ceiling, and photographs pinned to every available wall surface. But it was the photographs that made Marcus's breath catch. Dozens of crime scenes, all bearing the same hallmarks he'd witnessed. Groups of bodies, no visible wounds, the same terrible stillness. "Esperanza used to be a crime scene photographer," Carlos explained. until she started noticing patterns that her supervisors didn't want noticed. 23 years behind a camera, she said, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated horrors. I thought I'd seen everything human beings could do to each other. Then I started seeing things that weren't human at all. She led them to a map of Colombia covered in red pins, each marking a location. The pattern that emerged made Marcus's skin crawl, a network spanning the entire country, concentrated around major cities but extending into rural areas where witnesses would be scarce and investigations minimal. It's been going on for at least a decade, Esperanza continued, pointing to clusters of pins. Maybe longer, but it's accelerating. The incidents are becoming more frequent, more brazen. Marcus studied a photograph she handed him. A crime scene in Bogotá, 8 bodies arranged in a rough circle. What do they want? Power, said a new voice from the shadows near the back of the room. Marcus spun to see a man emerging from what he'd assumed was a closet. Thin, nervous, with the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors. Carlos tensed beside him. This is Father Montoya, Carlos said carefully. He's been researching the theological implications. The priest stepped into the light, and Marcus saw that his clerical collar was askew, his hands stained with ink, his eyes holding the fevered intensity of a man who'd glimpsed something that challenged his faith and found it wanting. Not just power, Father Montoya corrected, approaching the map. Transformation. They're changing things, changing people, the drug trade, the violence, the corruption. It's all feeding something larger. He pulled a leather-bound journal from his pocket, pages filled with handwriting in multiple languages. I've been comparing reports from here with similar incidents throughout history. Salem, Massachusetts, the witch trials in Europe, unexplained mass deaths during various conflicts. The patterns are consistent across centuries. Marcus felt something cold crawling up his spine. You're saying this has happened before? I'm saying this is still happening, has always been happening, but now they're operating in the open, using the cartel wars as cover for something unprecedented in scale. Esperanza moved to another wall, revealing a timeline that stretched back decades. Names Marcus recognized, cartel leaders, politicians, business magnates, all connected by red lines that formed an intricate web across the surface. Every person on this wall is connected to at least one incident, she said, but they're also connected to each other through legitimate business dealings, political alliances, family relationships. It's not just a criminal conspiracy, it's a shadow infrastructure running parallel to normal society. Carlos lit another cigarette, his hands steadier now that they were among allies. The question is, what do we do about it? We can't go to the authorities. Half of them are probably compromised. We can't go to the media without sounding like lunatics. And we can't just walk away because they've already seen us sniffing around. Father Montoya closed his journal and looked directly at Marcus. There's something else. The warehouse where you witnessed Escobar's demonstration. It wasn't random. That location has been used before by different groups for similar purposes. It's what I would call a thin place, somewhere the barriers between our world and elsewhere are permeable. The room fell silent except for the distant sounds of city traffic. Marcus studied the faces around him. A forensic pathologist driven from his profession, a photographer whose career ended when she documented the impossible, a priest whose faith had been tested by evidence of genuine supernatural evil, unlikely allies bound together by knowledge that could destroy them. How long do we have? Marcus asked. Esperanza consulted a chart covered in dates. Based on the escalation pattern, something big is coming. Soon. Marcus felt the weight of that single word, soon, settle into the room like a physical presence. He watched Esperanza's finger trace the escalating pattern of incidents on her chart, each date marking another group of impossible deaths, another crack in the facade of normal reality. Defined soon, he said, his voice rougher than intended. Father Montoya opened his journal again, flipping to a page covered in astronomical symbols and dates. There's a convergence coming. 3 days from now. New moon combined with certain other factors that these entities seem to find significant. You mean they're planning something for 3 days from now? Carlos translated, crushing out his cigarette with more force than necessary. I mean they've been building towards something for years, and all the patterns suggest it culminates in 3 days. The priest's hands shook slightly as he spoke. The question is whether we try to stop it or simply try to survive it. Marcus stood and walked to the wall of photographs, studying the faces of the dead. Cartel soldiers, yes, but also civilians. Men, women, teenagers whose only crime had been standing in the wrong place when reality decided to bend around Pablo Escobar's will. What would it take? He asked without turning around. To stop it, I mean. The silence stretched long enough that Marcus turned to find the three of them exchanging glances heavy with unspoken communication. You're talking about going after Escobar directly, Esperanza said finally. Not Pablo Escobar, the drug lord, the thing that's wearing his face. I'm talking about understanding what we're dealing with before more people die. Marcus moved back to the map, studying the network of connections. Every investigation starts with intelligence. We know when, we have an idea of where, but we don't know how or why. Carlos lit another cigarette, his third in 20 minutes. The warehouse isn't the only location. There are others, places where the incidents cluster, where reality seems thinner. Father Montoya nodded grimly. Sacred sites, most of them. Or places that were sacred before they were corrupted. Churches built over indigenous burial grounds, colonial buildings constructed with stones from ancient temples. The entities don't just use any location, they need places where the spiritual infrastructure already exists. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning heat outside. How many sites? In Medellin? 7 that we've identified. Esperanza moved to a detailed city map, pointing to locations marked with black X's. The warehouse where you witnessed the killings is one. There's also the old cathedral in El Centro, a mansion in El Poblado that's changed hands 6 times in the last decade, and others. Always places where multiple deaths have occurred, Carlos added, as if each incident makes the location more permeable. Marcus studied the map, his mind automatically calculating distances, sight lines, approach routes. 30 years of tactical thinking didn't disappear just because the target had supernatural abilities. If they need these specific locations, that's a vulnerability. It limits their options. It also means they're protecting them, Father Montoya warned. Each site has security that goes beyond normal cartel operations. Guards who never sleep, never eat, never seem entirely human. The priest's words hung in the air like smoke. Marcus found himself thinking about his granddaughter again, about her paint-covered fingers and innocent smile. What kind of world was he trying to preserve for her? What kind of world would exist if he failed? There's something else, Esperanza said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. She moved to a file cabinet and withdrew a folder marked with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The pattern isn't just local. We've been in contact with similar groups in other cities. She opened the folder to reveal correspondence from Mexico City, from Bogota, from cities across Central and South America. The handwriting varied, but the reports were disturbingly consistent. Mass deaths, supernatural phenomena, cartel leaders who operated with impossible immunity. It's coordinated, Marcus realized, the full scope of what they faced becoming clear. This isn't just about Medellin or even Colombia, it's hemispheric, which means whatever happens in 3 days isn't the end game, Carlos said. It's the next phase. Marcus felt the familiar sensation of pieces falling into place, the investigative instincts that had sustained him through 3 decades of hunting human monsters. But this time, the pattern that emerged was vast beyond anything he'd ever imagined, a conspiracy that spanned continents and challenged the fundamental nature of reality itself. We need to get closer, he said finally, to one of the sites, to the people involved, to whatever's really happening. Sitting here analyzing patterns won't stop what's coming. Father Montoya closed his journal with shaking hands. Getting closer means risking exposure, and exposure means becoming targets ourselves. Marcus looked around the room at his unlikely allies, 3 people who had sacrificed careers, safety, and sanity to document an impossible truth. In 3 days, that truth would manifest in ways none of them could fully predict. We're already targets, he said. The only question is whether we die as victims or as fighters. The words settled over the room like a death sentence. Marcus watched as his 3 unlikely allies processed what he'd just said, that their choice wasn't between safety and danger, but between dying passively or dying with purpose. Carlos was the first to break the silence, lighting yet another cigarette with hands that had found their steadiness in resignation. If we're going to be fighters, we need to know what we're fighting, and that means surveillance. The mansion in El Poblado, Esperanza said, moving back to the city map. It's the most accessible of the sites, and there's been unusual activity there over the past week. Vehicles arriving at night, people who don't match any known cartel profiles. Father Montoya shook his head violently. You don't understand what you're proposing. These aren't human adversaries who will simply shoot you if they catch you. What they do to people they capture. He opened his journal to a page that made Marcus's vision blur, filled with sketches and descriptions that seemed to writhe on the paper. Death would be a mercy. Marcus found himself thinking of the warehouse again, of 6 bodies drained of life in 45 seconds, of Pablo Escobar's smile in the moment before reality bent around his will. But alongside that memory came another, his granddaughter's voice on the phone 3 days ago, asking when Grandpa was coming home, promising to show him her new painting of a rainbow. Then we don't get caught, he said simply. Esperanza pulled out a detailed floor plan of the mansion, hand-drawn with the precision of someone who'd spent years documenting crime scenes. I've been watching the place for months. The normal security shifts change every 12 hours, but there are others who never leave. They patrol the grounds in patterns that don't make tactical sense unless you assume they guarding against threats that can approach from angles normal humans can't perceive. Marcus studied the drawing, noting the sight lines, the blind spots, the places where 3 decades of DEA experience suggested vulnerabilities might exist. What kind of activity have you observed? Rituals, Father Montoya said, his voice barely audible. I've seen them from a distance, through binoculars. Groups gathering in the courtyard at specific times, always when the moon is dark or nearly dark. They arrange themselves in patterns that hurt to look at directly, and then, he shuddered, things happen that shouldn't be possible. Carlos exhaled smoke in a long stream, studying the ceiling as if seeking answers in the water stains. The question is timing. Do we go tonight, while we still have the element of surprise? Or do we wait, gather more intelligence, and risk being discovered before we can act? Marcus felt the familiar weight of command decisions, the terrible calculus that had defined his career. How many lives to risk for how much intelligence? How much certainty was worth how much delay? But this time, the stakes weren't just tactical success or mission failure. This time, the enemy had already demonstrated abilities that transcended normal human understanding. Tonight, he decided, whatever's happening in 3 days, it's big enough that they'll be focusing their attention on preparation. That makes tonight our best chance to observe without being detected. Esperanza nodded grimly. I have equipment, night vision, telephoto lenses, recording devices. Not that recordings of this kind of thing tend to survive long-term exposure. What do you mean? Marcus asked. Electronic devices malfunction around these sites, she explained. Cameras produce images that change when you're not looking at them. Audio recordings develop voices that weren't there during the original event. Digital files corrupt themselves in ways that follow patterns too specific to be random. Father Montoya closed his journal and tucked it inside his jacket. Reality itself becomes unstable in their presence. What you observe with your own eyes may be the only reliable record of what actually occurs. Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear exactly, but a profound recognition of how far beyond his experience this had moved. 30 years of hunting cartel leaders had taught him to read human behavior, to anticipate tactical responses, to understand the psychology of violence and greed. But this required him to abandon everything he thought he knew about the fundamental nature of existence. Equipment check at sundown, he said, falling back on the familiar rhythms of operational planning. We approach the mansion after full dark, establish observation positions, and document whatever we can. No direct contact, no interference, no matter what we observe. Carlos ground out his cigarette. And if what we observe is worse than we expected? Marcus looked around the room one final time, at the walls covered with evidence of impossible crimes, at the map-marking sites where reality grew thin, at three people who had already sacrificed everything to document a truth too terrible for normal minds to accept. Then we learn exactly what we're up against, he said. And tomorrow we decide whether we're prepared to face it. The ordeal was beginning. The night air in El Poblado carried the scent of jasmine and something else, something that made Marcus's skin crawl without explanation. He crouched behind the stone wall bordering the mansion's grounds, checking his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. 11:47 p.m. Carlos should have been in position on the north side by now, with Esperanza covering the eastern approach and Father Montoya maintaining overwatch from the church bell tower 6 blocks away. The plan had seemed solid during their afternoon briefing. Simple observation, multiple angles, document whatever ritual or gathering occurred. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. Get in, get intelligence, get out alive. Marcus adjusted the night vision scope and swept the mansion's courtyard. Empty. The windows showed no movement, no lights except for the faint glow that seemed to emanate from the building's walls themselves, a luminescence that his equipment couldn't quite capture properly. His radio crackled with Carlos's voice, barely a whisper. North perimeter secured. No movement on the grounds, but there's something wrong with the shadows here. They're moving independent of any light source. Copy that, Marcus replied, though Carlos's report sent ice through his veins. Esperanza, report. Silence. Esperanza, do you copy? More silence, followed by a burst of static that resolved into what might have been screaming before cutting out entirely. Marcus felt 30 years of operational instincts screaming at him to abort, to fall back, to live to fight another day. But through his scope, he could see the mansion's front doors opening. Figures emerged, a dozen people in dark clothing moving with the synchronized precision of a military unit, except their coordination was too perfect, too inhuman. At the center of the group walked a familiar silhouette. Even at this distance, even through night vision equipment, Pablo Escobar's presence was unmistakable. But there was something fundamentally wrong with the way he moved, as if gravity affected him differently than it did the others. Carlos, are you seeing this? Marcus whispered into his radio. The response came not from his earpiece, but from directly behind him. He sees everything now. Marcus spun to find Carlos standing 3 feet away, but wrong. His face slack, his eyes reflecting light that wasn't there, his mouth moving in synchronization with words that emerged from somewhere else entirely. The man who had been his ally 12 hours ago was gone, replaced by something wearing his face like an ill-fitting mask. Before Marcus could react, his vision exploded into stars. Something struck him from the side with inhuman force, sending him tumbling over the stone wall and into the mansion's courtyard. His night vision scope shattered against the flagstones, leaving him effectively blind in the supernatural darkness. Hands grabbed him. Too many hands, moving with that same impossible coordination he'd observed through his scope. They hauled him upright and dragged him toward the center of the courtyard, where the other figures had arranged themselves in a pattern that hurt to perceive directly. Pablo Escobar stood waiting, but up close the illusion of humanity was even thinner. His skin had a waxy quality that suggested it might not be skin at all, and when he smiled, the expression extended far beyond the normal boundaries of his face. Marcus Reeves, the thing said in Escobar's voice layered with harmonics that no human throat could produce. You have been very persistent, very troublesome. Through the ringing in his ears, Marcus could hear Father Montoya's voice over the radio, frantic and desperate. They have Esperanza. Dear God, what they're doing to her. Marcus, if you can hear this, run. Everything we planned was wrong. This was a trap from the beginning. The transmission cut off with a wet sound that Marcus tried not to interpret. Your friends have served their purpose, the Escobar thing continued, circling Marcus with predatory grace. 3 years of careful manipulation, feeding them just enough truth to make them feel like investigators rather than prey. They led us to DEA operatives still interested in my activities, to priests asking the wrong questions, to photographers whose cameras captured things they shouldn't have seen. Marcus felt the world tilting as the full scope of his failure became clear. Not just tonight's operation, but everything since the warehouse. Carlos's convenient knowledge, Esperanza's perfectly documented evidence, Father Montoya's theological insights, all of it orchestrated, designed to draw him deeper into a trap that had been closing around him for months. The ritual requires specific elements, the thing explained, gesturing to the pattern formed by its companions: fear, understanding, and the willing sacrifice of someone who has spent their life fighting evil. Your terror is exquisite, your comprehension of what you face is complete, and your willingness to die for others is exactly what we need. In the distance, Marcus could hear sirens, police, military, someone responding to Father Montoya's desperate calls. But they were too far away, and time was running out. The pattern around him was beginning to glow with that same wrong light he'd seen emanating from the mansion's walls. Everything had fallen apart. His allies were dead or corrupted, his intelligence was worthless, and his granddaughter would grow up in a world where things like this walked freely among the living. The entity wearing Pablo Escobar's face raised its arms, and reality began to bend,